Hello, this is Dan Joseph of the China Learning Curve. Welcome to the video portion of our January 2015 newsletter. We have one goal in mind: to make it quick and easy for you to stay current on China. We do this by focusing on the single question that we think is most important to any business person active in China, and that is China still on track? Is China still on the path toward more growth and development? Now, to address this question, we focus primarily on three key areas. Number one, the economy, or what we might call macroeconomic management: GDP growth, debt levels, inflation, these sorts of things. How is China managing the economy? Secondly, economic liberalization. As we like to say, China hasn't enjoyed over 30 years of virtually unprecedented economic growth because communism suddenly worked. Rather, it has been the gradual transition to a more free market-oriented system that has propelled China's growth, and we keep an eye on the liberalization measures to see if that trend is going to continue. And then thirdly, in our law and politics section, we focus mostly on the rule of law. All emerging markets have issues relative to the rule of law, and we don't expect China to fix them overnight. But is China taking the steps necessary to strengthen the rule of law and to make the business environment fairer for everyone? So those are our three main categories. Everything else we kind of lump into what we might call other. And in our other category, we focus mainly on what we might call non-economic risk factors, things like tensions in the South China Sea, or demographic issues or environmental issues that over the long term could in fact impact economic growth. First up, economic news. As we said in last month's 2014 Year in Review newsletter, the key in 2015 for China is how will it balance growth and debt. It is estimated that China's debt to GDP ratio has reached about 250%. And that's not crisis levels yet. Keep in mind that most of the developed world, like the United States, Europe, Japan, is more like 300% or greater. So 250% isn't a crisis yet, but it is twice the level that China was at 5 years ago. And that rate of debt accumulation is not sustainable. For those who would like to see China take a more cautious approach to debt, there was good news in January. Senior leaders in China, the president, the prime minister, the head of the central bank, all made public statements signaling that they intend to be more cautious when it comes to debt creation. The key phrases that were used were that China's entered a new normal phase and that China is willing to sacrifice growth for a more balanced economy. So the highest levels of government are sending the right signals when it comes to controlling the debt situation. At the same time, also in January, the National Development and Reform Commission announced a new 1.1 trillion US dollar spending plan that covers about 300 projects. Now, the NDRC is saying this isn't new spending, it's just previously approved plans, and they're accelerating the investments forward in order to support the economy. And they went to great lengths to emphasize that this is not a stimulus program and is nothing like the 2008 stimulus program that is credited with creating such wasteful spending and exacerbating China's debt problem. Time will tell if, in fact, this is new spending or not. In related news, year-end data on debt levels was mixed. On the one hand, total financing within the economy grew at its slowest rate since 2007. On the other hand, the rate of growth in total financing was twice the rate of growth of GDP. So that means that debt to GDP continued to increase in 2014. So to sum it up, the main issue for the Chinese economy in 2015 is how will growth and debt be balanced. On the one hand, we have senior government officials signaling a cautious approach to spending and debt creation will be taken. On the other hand, we see signs that changing habits relative to spending and debt might be easier said than done. So this is definitely an issue that we'll have to keep an eye on. Also in this issue of the newsletter, a brief story about exchange rates and reserves in China. After peaking at about 3.99 trillion in June, foreign exchange reserves in China dropped to 3.84 trillion US dollars by the end of the year. And the RMB exchange rate, after rising by about 12.8% over the last 4 years and about more than 25% over the last 10 years, actually fell 2.4% in 2014. Of course, we're used to seeing these things, rates and reserves in China, move in only one direction, up. But two-way volatility has been developing for a while, primarily because it's not just trade flows that matter anymore, but also capital flows. And with the increased uncertainty about the future of the Chinese economy, it seems there is increasing sentiment to diversify out of RMB and into dollars. Of course, in the past, there's always been the allegation that China doesn't want its currency to rise too fast and will intervene in the market to prevent it from doing so. The last few months, we've seen the opposite situation. The PBOC intervening in the market to prevent the RMB from falling too quickly, ostensibly to prevent capital outflows from increasing. We don't do exchange rate forecasts at the China Learning Curve, but it does seem safe to say that 2014 provided further confirmation that two-way volatility is the new normal in the RMB, and it seems likely that regardless of the direction the RMB might go, the government will do what it can to assure that it's a gradual transition. From the economy, we turn our attention to economic liberalization. We have a brief story in this issue of the newsletter on free trade zones. The first free trade zone was opened in Shanghai in 2013. The main benefits of the zones are, first, lowering administrative burdens for business, secondly, opening more sectors of the Chinese economy to foreign investment, and thirdly, making it easy for currency and capital to cross border in China, for example, for a foreign company to loan money to or borrow money from its Chinese subsidiaries. And there have been a number of recent developments indicating that the free trade zone concept is gaining momentum. First of all, the Shanghai Free Trade Zone was granted permission to quadruple in size. Secondly, 3 other cities, Fujian, Tianjin, and Guangdong, received preliminary permission to open their own free trade zones. And thirdly, in January, the State Council, which is roughly equivalent to a president's cabinet in the U.S. government, issued a paper in which it basically endorsed many of the benefits of a free trade zone and suggested that they should be spread throughout the country. Recall that when China first initiated its economic liberalization program in 1980, it relied heavily on special economic zones, which, like free trade zones, were confined geographic areas in which you had special economic rights. At that time, the special economic zones over the years spread to many different cities and then became the rules for the entire country. And that's the idea for the free trade zones. They will similarly spread, and these recent indications of momentum for the free trade zone is a good sign for liberalization in China. Also in economic liberalization, we have a couple of stories that could perhaps best be introduced by an anecdote that was reported in the paper this past month. Apparently there was a real estate industry conference. The CEO of a large real estate company stood up and said the following to his colleagues. He said they were no longer the wife of the government. They had become the government's mistress because the government has now taken the high-tech industry as its wife, so they had to get used to being second-class citizens. Along those lines, the two stories we have in the liberalization section are, one, the involvement of companies like Alibaba and Tencent and other technology firms in the financial sector, first in the formation of private banks, and secondly in a new initiative announced in January by the People's Bank of China to start a credit reporting agency, which would be an important step toward privatizing the entire financial system. And it seems like some of the high-tech companies are going to be asked to be involved in that. Secondly, every year there's a large media and advertising company that does a survey and publishes the list of the 100 most valuable brands in China. And for the first time, the number one brand is not a state-owned enterprise, China Mobile, but rather one of those technology companies, Tencent. And also for the first time, the largest sector is no longer the banking sector, which again, state-owned enterprises, but is now the technology sector. So again, that's just confirmation of the trend that we have seen over the years in China, which is that it is the private part of the economy that is the most creative, the most dynamic, and creates the most jobs. And we start seeing that reflected in things like how the government treats various industries, and also in the value of those various companies. So look in the newsletter for those more details for those stories. Referencing that husband-wife-mistress story, it appears the newlyweds have had their first spat. In January, the State Administration for Industry and Commerce, one of China's leading regulators, issued a report that was highly critical of Alibaba, arguably China's most high-profile technology company. The report included many allegations, including that Alibaba ignored the sale of fake and counterfeit items, that Alibaba staffers received bribes in exchange for improving search results for sellers on the site, and also that Alibaba ignored the practice by some sellers of faking transactions in order to improve their total volume reported on the site. Now, the most unique aspect of this is actually Alibaba's reaction, which was anything but timid. They issued their own statement after the report came out, and it included language such as condemning the investigator's procedural misconduct and criticizing his irrational enforcement of the law, which they said led him to obtain a biased conclusion based on the wrong methodology. So this is not a typical way to publicly respond to criticism from the Chinese government. Keep in mind that this was only a report from the SAIC and not a legal action. So moving forward, it'll be interesting to see how far the SAIC goes to prove these allegations, to punish Alibaba if necessary, or to prevent these misdeeds from happening again. Particularly from a rule of law point of view, this will be something worth watching. Our last story, also under Law and Politics, concerns internet access in China. What happens when restricting access to the internet, as China does, impacts not only politics, but also business and science? That's the question China might have to answer soon enough. Now, we all know that China restricts access to the internet. You might know that using VPNs or virtual private networks, people can get around those restrictions. Well, in January, a number of VPN service providers reported that their service had been disrupted in China, and there are strong signals that it was the Chinese government behind the disruptions. Other email service providers reported the same thing and also think it might be the government behind the disruptions. Now, this is nothing new. Since Xi Jinping took office a couple of years ago, there's been a gradual clamping down on sharing of ideas and opinions and accessing the internet and that sort of thing. But at this point, there are already reports, pretty strong reports, that access to information on an international basis is becoming so tight in China, it's going to impact the way people do business. So it'll be interesting to see going forward, first, whether China continues to kind of tighten this grip on the internet, and secondly, whether the impact stretches outside the field of politics and therefore makes it even more difficult for China to pursue that course of action. More information on that in the written newsletter. For more detail on these stories and for additional stories, please see the written version of our newsletter. And remember, we only need 15 minutes a month to keep you up to date on China. See you next month.